Without any further ado, let's crack on with the second session. So again, like with the first panel, if we just briefly go around the room first, say who you are and the institution you're from, and then we'll kick off with our first question. Karen, start.
Karen, yeah, is this working?
Is that working?
Yeah, I think. From the Institute for Work Skills and Employment at the University of Duisburg-Essen in Germany. And this is a research institute which we have now around 50 researchers. So we grew over the last 10 years to 20 years. And I think we have started with doing a lot of research on the regional level. That's why we were created in the first place. But we have become more, well, we have gone with the flow, let's say, of the followed suite of the internationalization of labor markets and the economy. So a lot of us are working on this multi-level regulatory systems that I am going to speak about in a minute.
Okay, thank you.
Hi, everyone. Dalia Gesualdi. I'm a professor at the School of Industrial Relations at the University of Montreal and director of CRIMT at the Interuniversity Research Center on Globalization and Work. We lead a very vast partnership on experimentation and better work that several of you probably know that brings together 180 researchers in 12 countries.
Thanks.
Hi, everybody. My name is Joan-Michel Bert. I'm the director of the Sociological Research Center on Everyday Life and Work, long name. We call it Catalan Quit, actually it has it's a long story. I'm not going to explain to you. Just a shorter name for the Catalan name, that center. But I'm here together with Oscar Molina, who's there, who is the director of the Institute for Labor Market Studies. We actually, as a center, are part of the institute. The institute is an interdisciplinary institute with 3 main centers. Our center is mostly composed by sociologists, but also by economists. Another one centered on labor law. Another one centered on psychological risk, work precarization, and health. So the institute, which is called EIT, is AIT is this is the interdisciplinary approach, but we are mostly sociologists. We are the bigger center inside the institute.
Thank you. Ian?
Hi, so I'm Ian Greer from the United States. I work at a big entity called the School of Industrial and Labor Relations at Cornell University, which is in Ithaca in upstate New York. There's an umbrella called CAROW, which is a subset of all that, dozens and dozens of researchers and teachers. That's the Center on Applied Research on Work. Then under that is my organization, the Ithaca CoLab, which does engaged research in the region.
Thank you, Ian.
Yeah, I'm Matt Johnson, Senior Lecturer in HRM and Employment Studies based at the Work Inequalities Institute, which has probably received as much promotion as it's possible to get at this conference already. But obviously a very broad research institute, but united by the common threads of work and equalities, obviously.
Thanks, Matt. So the purpose of the second panel is about policy and practice, okay? So what we want to find out about is the fact that one of the aims of Network is to increase impact of work and employment research on policy and practice. Can each of you reflect either on how work and employment research could improve policy and practice, either drawing on your past experience or of working with external partners, or thinking about what needs to be done to meet these emerging challenges? So Karen, I'll ask you that question first.
Yeah, I think in particular the current political landscape, I think one important contribution that we can make is starting and making visible local level politics and practice, and the bottom-up institution building in a multi-level regulatory system. That's in order to overcome non-politics, which would basically mean to continue the status quo, which is not what we want. And that's one key takeaway lesson I written from research I've been doing with other researchers in this room on public sector outsourcing and public procurement. So in different European countries, and it might perhaps come as a surprise because you know that a lot of things are regulated from the supranational level, including on public procurement, for instance. But I think that local level policies and practices are becoming more important, have become more important, and are still becoming more important. And that's for several reasons. And one is, of course, that there is a lack of majorities who are supporting progressive policies at this national or supranational level. Policies that would address the new needs and risks that are emerging with the changing social, economic, etc. environment. So there would be non-politics from the supranational level, or from the national also, if there weren't local level policies. And you can see from the works that have been done on new labor federalism in the US, I think that there's a lot of things going on at the local, at the state level, at the local level, which try to fill these gaps and quite successfully so to some extent. So introducing policies on working time regulation, on minimum wages, on paid sick leave, etc., which don't come from the national level. And then, so there is, let's say there's a void at the supranational or national level, so therefore it needs local level policies. And then there's another situation where you have regulation from the supranational level, but actually this regulation shifts back the conflicts to the local level nevertheless. And that's because, well, there are also opposing alliances of actors, and that kind of agree on a coherence scheme. So the result is some kind of compromise, and the compromise is not to meet halfway, but it's piling up goals and principles in a not very coherent way. I mean, that's something probably which is also a very old thing, but I think it's getting more important. At least it's a situation which is characteristic of, for instance, this public procurement regulation. So the conflict actually is shifted back to the local level, and then the non-politics that occur at this level, that is not necessarily because, well, people prefer to stick to the status quo, but because they are well, a little baffled and anxious in this situation of legal ambiguity. So, I mean, there's a lot of studies who've shown how the law has been used as a mask and shield in order to protect the liberal market order from any meaningful changes. And it seems to be, to me, that now you have the legal ambiguity, which is sometimes deliberately perhaps used as a mask and shield to do nothing. But also it's just a very complex, thick web of rules which local level politicians or administrative decision makers are faced with. And I think in this situation, in all these situations, it's very important to make visible that this experimentation, which occurs nevertheless, and to show the difficulties, but also to showcase the successes, and to help, thereby helping local level politics to navigate this legal uncertainty. So I can give a few examples if you want.
Well, we will perhaps come back to later, Karen. Thank you. Dalia.
Yes, thank you. So I'm going to answer the question, what needs to be done to meet the emerging challenges? And we have to say that the challenges are numerous. So maybe one challenge is how the impact of different disruptions, tech changes, climate change, on the effectiveness of worker protection. So this is an old question, but why is it reviewed today? It's because the way we answer to these disruptions give way to a fragmented regulatory landscape. So there's different examples to this to show how, to illustrate basically the synergy, but also the antagonism between labor law, employment policies, and other frameworks, other regulatory frameworks that largely determine, at least to some extent, the working conditions and rights and obligations of employers and employees. And I'm just going to give a few examples, and I think this needs to be thought of in terms of research in order to really propose adequate policy, but also actor responses to answer the consequences of this fragmented landscape. So some example, the nexus between immigration policy and labor law. Immigration policy often determines the working conditions of migrants, and it has to be thought of when thinking about labor law and employment policy. Other examples, and this was obvious in the COVID-19 crisis, the nexus between public health rules and occupational health and safety are two frameworks that in some cases speak to each other, in other cases are completely operated by different institutions and actors. The third example is the important impact of privacy rules on labor relations when regulating algorithm management. And here it's the level of comfort that actors have to navigate these very technical rules and to seize them to build new strategies in terms of labor relations. So how can, and I think this is really the crux of the matter, how can research help think these issues and really understand the impact of the interface between these different regulatory frameworks and really shed light on how to basically give way to proper policy? And it's really looking at how do actors navigate these different frameworks, but how these frameworks dialogues and how this dialogue gives way to strategies, but also to constraints, and also can become distilling for worker representatives and workers, and what can be done to answer these challenges, both in terms of public policy, but also in terms of actor response.
Thank you, Dalia. Joan.
I will answer to your question, focusing in an issue that is very common and very important in social policies, which is youth unemployment. And I would say that the first problem with a standard approach to youth unemployment is its simplistic, or I would say reductionist approach, considering that workers are just individuals. When you think or when you address young people or young workers, I think you have to broad very much and contextualize and do a better contextualizing work to know who you are addressing or who you are dealing with. This means, and the theoretical part of my intervention, then the example will come. I think you have to broaden this in 3 dimensions. One is broadening it over time. Young people are in transitions from school to work. So first of all, when you consider youth unemployment, you have to look at the place of unemployment in the labor market trajectory. It's not the same having unemployment at the beginning, than in the middle, the end of the youth, or when you are already older. Secondly, you have to broaden in terms of all the other youth transitions. Young person is not only someone who's looking for a job, who's looking for employment after training, is also someone who is doing a transition between living with the family, having an independent family, or maybe transitioning to parenting. This means you have to have into account the social constant, the origin, the family origin, the social background, also the ethnic background that changes a lot these transitions. And then you have to broaden this beyond individuals. It means the immediate context. You have social relations, you have social connection, you have a place where you live, and this was, I don't know if you were there, and there were not so many people this morning in that session. The parallel session, there was one about young people in the labor market, and there was very interesting research that's looking at the local level. That is very, very important, not only because policies, or many of them are designed at the local level, but because the local level is providing different opportunities and different contexts for employment. So that's very important in terms of how you address and the standard that the mainstream approach to unemployment, to youth unemployment, is just considering young workers are like any other worker. You put just the variables, gender, ethnic origin, but you don't look at that in a comprehensive or contextualized approach. So that will be the first problem when we speak about youth unemployment. In terms of examples, I will provide you just 2 examples, which are not comparative. Both are based in research done in Spain, actually done in Catalonia, so that's northeast part of Spain. One is done, one by Oscar, one by me. One was a very different research, actually. The first one is a bench learning exercise. We were asked to reflect on the good practices to combat youth unemployment. And in this bench learning exercise, what we saw is that for many workers, unemployment begins at school. Actually, that's the very beginning of unemployment, because you have early school leavers with a very low qualifications, and at least in Spain, as indigenous comparative research, they are the bulk of unemployed young people. So actually, the most effective policies are not labor market policies, are policies that should be implemented at the school level. So again, this means maybe working with experts in education, not in labor market. So,
John, just conscious of time, but we'll perhaps the third example we'll come on to in the following discussion. Okay, but very, very fascinating. Thank you. Ian.
Yeah, so I'm just going to talk about what has happened with this job I have doing community engaged research in the region, which means that I have had to deal with the issue of the scarcity of labor, which Mikko mentioned in the previous session. The United States is unique among rich countries in having a general decline in labor force participation among prime working age people since about 2000. And I mean, what has happened, what was going on in the 80s, 90s, and 2000s, mass incarceration. So that's an important source of problems that workers and employers are having in the current labor market. And so one of the projects I ended up doing was with Adam Rosavitsky here, who's present. We did biographical interviews with people with criminal records, most of them Black and brown, some of them formerly incarcerated. And the idea for my part of the project was to think about what happens when you give people with criminal records relief, people who face discrimination at the stage of hiring and kind of general lifetime problems with not just with employment, but all kinds of other problems in their lives. So, you know, this one thing I like about these projects that we study and the policy behind it is it's very different from other labor market policies that I've looked at that didn't work. And one of the reasons why they didn't work is that they looked at the individual characteristics of people, such as their skill levels, and it ignored the broader structural issues. Another reason why they didn't work, which is something I talked about in a book with Charles Umney based on a bunch of European research, is they try and fix the labor supply by punishing the poor, when that in fact pushes people to the fringes of society. I mean, what it does do is it deals with some of the structural issues that exist in our labor market, which is very structured by race and gender. And you know, I can't say that it empowers people, but it's a very good window into the problems and intersecting forces of oppression that people face. And you know, this thing about criminal records and the carceral state, this is something that labor scholars haven't studied very much. It's been studied by sociologists, political scientists. So it's really interesting to talk about this with people who haven't thought about it before. So that's it for me.
Thank you, Ian. Okay, thank you. Matt.
You're even doing the comparing now, Ian. Yeah, I'm going to kind of reflect on some general thoughts and then kind of go into some more specific points about work that I've done, particularly with Ava and other colleagues around the living wage. So obviously the premise of the panel was how research can inform policymaking, and obviously it can do. But I think probably one of the problems we've got now is that there is so much research out there from academia, from policy think tanks, from media commentators, commission research. There is masses of it. So in some senses, it's how do you compete in a very crowded space? There's lots of competing voices there, all trying to get the attention of practitioners and policymakers. And I suppose the issue is how do we kind of maintain that interdisciplinary, international perspective, how do we maintain the kind of focus on the complexity and the nuance? And I think this is where the paradox lies, in that in order to get some attention, to get some exposure, to kind of cut through, it maybe steers us towards quite simplistic or generalized points about the labour market, about the economy, about, you know, wage setting systems, or whatever it might be. Policymakers are obviously looking for something that they can pick up, they can make sense of, they can use, they can get behind. You know, they quite often have to sell it to their, you know, superiors, whoever they may be. So they need to know exactly, does it work, doesn't it work, why should I get behind it? So I think that's where we potentially strip out some of that nuance, some of that complexity, the interdisciplinary stuff that we all believe in. So I think the living wage is a really good example of that. So you have something that is popular, it has kind of brand recognition, if you want to use that kind of awful language, but people kind of have a sense of what it is and what it's about. Politicians seem to like it, they can kind of get behind it. Employers seem to have responded pretty well to it. But I think the issue is it maybe detracts from a focus on some of the structural issues in the labour market. So it becomes about, okay, how do we get politicians to put this into their kind of manifesto? How do we get public authorities to write it into their procurement plans? How do we get employers to sign up? And it maybe gives the impression that pay, or the issue of pay, can be solved with a simple policy. So you're dealing with poverty pay, you're dealing with inequality, you're dealing with, you know, staff turnover, productivity, morale. It's kind of seen as a panacea for all of these things. And unsurprisingly, quite often when you look at it in reality, it comes up short. It can't kind of deliver on all of these objectives. So our job, I suppose, is to position that as one possible measure, or one part of a package of measures that deal with kind of structural factors in the labour market. So that's to do with working time, working hours, working conditions, social protection, rights, voice, you know, a whole raft of things. So I suppose for us, the message we've been trying to promote, or trying to kind of give attention to, is that the living wage, or something similar to that, is the start rather than the end of the conversation. This is a foot in the door to start talking about these kind of broader issues. So I think to how you deal with that, one way obviously is to craft a good message. So you need to have a good story to tell. And, you know, at the risk of sounding like a kind of under pressure football manager, you have to trust the process. You have to believe that the research you're doing is good and worthwhile, and you know, you will find an audience. I think the second point is also maybe looking for allies rather than competitors. So we are in this kind of very dynamic and competitive space, but trying to find allies who are saying similar things, and, you know, kind of approaching things in a similar way to you. And the third point, I think what we've learned from a local level particularly, is building kind of ongoing relationships. So this isn't just a one-time thing where you do a piece of work, present it to someone, and that's that. You have to be having those ongoing conversations, so you can kind of explore the limitations and the problems that arise during the implementation.
Thank you, Matt. Thank you. Just before we take it to the floor, you talked about the crowded space. I think it's quite an interesting point. Is it the same in other countries? Is it like, here in the UK, as Matt says, it's extremely crowded space in terms of getting your voice heard. Is it the same in other countries? Yes? No? Ian?
Well, where I'm sitting,
that's quite relevant.
Where I'm sitting in New York State, it's not a crowded space at all. It's actually very rare that I come across academics who are doing, who are actually sitting there with like the movements, who are trying to make change. There's not a lot of like research funding for applied research in New York State, so that's part of it. The incentives are to be very academic, though, if you're a researcher. And so for some strange reason, I don't really have a clear incentive structure, so I just make my way into those papers.
So a little different. Okay.
I would say just very shortly. No, that sometimes what happens is that there's no space, which is different.
Yeah.
It's not crowded, it's just it's complete out of any discussion, a public discussion. Yeah, and the example is very clean in Spain with young people. Just I'm short now.
Yeah.
So I just wanted to say that.
Yeah.
It's just there's no public space for this kind of issues sometimes.
Yeah. Okay. Oh, sorry, Karen.
course, there are topics where there's a lot of research and also commissioned research, etc., like platforms, etc. But then the problem is not just there's a lot of research, but the problem is also there's no actors, or you don't have someone whom you can really address and give this, because workers are not organized, for instance, or you don't have the trade unions really that you can try to establish a dialogue, or it's more difficult, let's say. So
Yeah.
another topic.
Okay, let's open to the floor. Questions? Must be some questions. Don't be shy. Come on, we've got about 10 minutes. Yes, question over here from Sheena. And there's another one at the back as well, further up. Okay.
Save you a little bit of a walk. Thank you very much. Really interesting discussion. I just wondered, I mean, we've talked a bit about what the priorities might need to be. What do you think are the challenges in terms of doing these kind of comparative studies, and what are the challenges that maybe WorkNet anticipate facing, and how do you think we might be able to overcome those? If that's not too general a question, I know it's quite general, but yeah, what are the challenges in the future to research in this kind of?
Who'd like to take that one? Would you want to think about it while we have a second question?
Well, I could.
Okay.
I mean, I think there's a real problem with the incentive structure and the way that resources are directed. So I find it very difficult to do the part of my job where I bring academic researchers into these projects, because if you're an assistant professor in the United States, you need to get the publications out. Otherwise, you'll have to find a job somewhere else. I think in Europe, you have the advantage that there's a lot of funding for intellectual exchange on policy issues and applied research on labor and other things. We don't have that in the United States. So, I mean, I find in Europe, you all are way better equipped for this than the United States.
Because that is therein part of the reason why the network is being set up, so that you can learn from perhaps what we do here in Europe.
Yeah, well, I've worked here for 10 years. And so that's where I developed a lot of my thinking and the theory that goes into my work. And I mean, in some ways it was easier for me in the US because that's where I'm from. Everywhere else, I'm a foreigner, and it's harder to build trust and harder to be part of the conversation.
Okay, well, the challenges, question was around the challenges. Dalia or Joe?
I think
Karen?
one of the big problems is in disorganized capitalism is to get access to the actors that we want to interview. So that's a challenge we face in every project we do in qualitative research, and I think there's a reason for it. So I think what Mark said is very important. You need to have established these long-term, or it would be good to establish these long-term connections, and it takes time, not just in order to tell them about your findings, but also to get the information in the first place. So that's I think the challenge that we need to reflect on more.
Yeah. Dalia?
So maybe more on challenges as to how to do the research, but I think what we're seeing right now is, of course, we have national, local institutions, we have our labor relations systems, but I think there's common trends right now that speak up to comparing the consequences of those trends. And one example I want to give out that I think needs to give some thought is the social protection perspective and bridging what's going on in terms of the schemes that are brought forward and to labor and employment research in terms of what's happening to the labor market right now and how social protection is adapted or not to that. This discussion more and more is being pushed away because what's being laid out right now in several national contexts is rather fiscal measures that will address COVID crisis, that will address inflation very punctually through tax expenditures. But the reflection on the labor market and social protection is being brushed out. And I think that's a big concern because those are trends that, are coming from certain parts of the world and that are slowly seeping into other national contexts that are not used to those kinds of policy approaches or measures. So I think that speaks a lot to why we have to do comparative work in terms of how trends spark up in a specific context in terms of policy and can lead their way to other contexts, and how, strangely enough, even if labor institutions are different, even if our labor relations system is different, it actually works. Those ideas get built into what's being done in different contexts. So I think that's one of the reasons we have to pursue comparative work. And I'm going to just
Okay. We have another question. You come in and then we'll take a question.
I will be very short also this time.
No.
I think I want to go to Ian. I think structures are very important, and I would say, and you go in a different way to answer the same question. I think the institutional framing of research is very important nowadays. We all have to publish, we all have to present competitive research projects. And that means that usually you use just quantitative data to have quick publication, because the qualitative or well done comparative research takes much more time. So I would say nowadays we have a very bad comparative research, very bad international comparative research, because we do quick comparative research, which is not a good one. And that's a challenge. I mean, how to address this framework doing good research, which is a bit contradictory. So that's a big challenge.
Thank you. We have another question just near the back, actually. There's a lady behind you as well. There were two up here. You sure? Okay. The time works yourselves. You'd like to ask. Okay.
It might be quite basic, but
Just introduce yourself.
I'm Ava Herman from the WI, University of Manchester. My question is about how, if we are trying to influence these local policymakers or influence policy, how can we make sure that our comparative examples are as context specific and adequate to the local context in which we're trying to influence, if that makes sense? So how do we build these relationships, get good research, but also provide to make sure that the cases that we're providing them can be adapted and can be used and discussed? I hope that, yeah, maybe that's too difficult. Sorry.
Who'd like to take that question? Ian?
So when I got started doing this, I was curious if my international comparative research and the examples I knew about in Europe were of interest at all to the local policymakers or state or national policymakers. And I learned that they are not. So somehow they get excited about very specific things. Like I remember once in Britain talking to an MP about welfare to work programs, and he was excited about Denmark. So there was an international comparative project, and Danish colleagues came over and they like talked with him, and we got an interview. But it's always, in my experience, it's always really random stuff like that that policymakers fixate on, and then you have to like supply information about that example that they want to know about.
Okay.
So I have exactly the same experience. When you're trying to convince policymakers on how relevant it is to know what's happening in the rest of the world, they usually roll their eyes. I'd even go through and say, okay, what's happening in Ontario, the province next to the Quebec, or in Canada, it's what's happening in the US. So, but there I think that we have an extra mile to do, because we have to get our research, our comparative research, translated in a way policymakers can understand the relevancy of understanding what's happening elsewhere. So the example of platforms is a wonderful example, because when you speak to a policymaker about the EU directive, they roll their eyes in Canada. Like, what do we care about EU? It's so far, for them, it's something that's completely out of reach. But then how you show that the issues that led to the EU directive are the same issues that we have locally, and how can what was behind the ideas and research and I'd say policy perspective behind the EU directive, and how that's that you can compare that to what's happening locally. Then you will get them interested in understanding what were the mechanisms of reflection behind a specific initiative. So I have to say, I think that in terms of research, we have an extra mile to do to make comparative analysis for policymakers to digest comparative analysis and to make it relevant to the national context. So it's a complete back and forth, in my perspective, of understanding the national issues and what comparative analysis can do, but comparing is not enough. We have to go the extra mile, and we have a responsibility in that perspective.
Karen?
Yeah, I think I have a slightly different experience when it comes to doing comparisons between very different settings, where you could assume, and that's part of the experience that you've made, well, that actors then saying, well, that's a completely different setting, so we cannot learn anything from it. So my experience is actually, well, firstly, a lot of the experimentation that we look at actually occurs outside the established institutional order. So there are actors try to come up with new solutions, and there's not necessarily let's say a regulatory framework which prohibits actors in other countries to do the same. Well, to give an example from this one project we did, where in Italy there was a well, at local level, the trade unions got involved by the administrations, and they were asked to sit down with them both in the bidding and the phase when before the tender is put out.
Yep.
To specify what is put in the tender, and then also afterwards to watch over the enforcement and to sit down when there were any complaints raised. So nobody actually in Germany would prohibit this to local actors to do the same. They could do that. So I think there is a lot of space actually when it comes to addressing new concerns, and also what I learned from interviews. So basically, when I try, I'm happy to give you some information back or some disseminate the findings. They tend to be more interested in what's happening elsewhere. So because they know what's happening in Germany, they know well, what they do in their organization. They are more interested in what's happening in other organizations, but also in other countries. Of course, mostly within the European context, which is already relatively coherent. So, but still, I think there's also very interesting examples of things going on elsewhere.
Do you want to come back, or Matt?
Yeah, maybe just to add to that, something that we've found is perhaps focusing on positive examples from elsewhere can be quite kind of uplifting for people. So they know the negative stories about their own context, they know the problems, they know the issues, but giving them an illustration of where it can work better or quite well can be quite kind of motivation, I think, to maintain that.
Okay. We've probably got time for one very quick final question. Yes, lady at the front. Sorry. Okay, we're coming. Okay. Okay.
Okay, I'm Ute Klammer. I'm director of the IAQ, the institute Karen Jaehrling is representing on this panel. So this panel is about policy advice and bringing our findings into society and to politicians. And I just want to share some of the increasing tensions I'm aware of, at least when I look at the German situation. I would like to see what you think about it. As I see in Germany, there is an increasing expectation towards research in the social sciences, economics, to become active, to become involved in the political process. We talk about third mission of universities, and I know this is a big debate in the UK as well, where you even have to prove that you have that your research has had an impact on politicians. At the same time, the criteria for academic careers are much more, as you pointed out, focused on publications, reference publications, third-party money, and so on. And in particular, young researchers don't really have the time to get involved in these processes. The second problem is that politics have other time frames than research, and they always complain that you need too long for your research. You need it next month, and you need 3 years, so that you are too late. And there's another conflict.
Okay.
And then there is a conflict that there are an increasing number of lobbying bodies, whereas we just want to present proper research. And so there's a lot of tensions
Yeah.
in this business. And I would like to know your opinions about your countries.
Thank you for your questions. It's very good points you made there. Very briefly, the panel. Very briefly, Ian.
Increasingly, we are just told to go away by policymakers because what we say is inconvenient. The thing about timeframes, though, is interesting, and I experience it almost the opposite of how you described it. So, in order to get a policy passed, even like a little technocratic one that shouldn't be controversial, it takes years because I don't know how other countries are, but our legislative process is just very slow and dysfunctional. And so you really have to hang in there for a long time in order to get anything done, I find. And of course, that's the incentive structure that tells you not to do that.
Who'd like the final word? We could just wrap it up. Anyone else like to come in on that final question? Sure.
Yeah, my experience is that there are like two different levels. I think at the national level, I completely agree with Ian and with Uther's intervention. But my experience, I've been in the academia maybe for the last 25 years, so I'm quite old there, is that recently at more local or regional level, institutions or policymakers are approaching universities. So we were asked just to have to disseminate, your research should have an impact. But recently, maybe finally, and maybe because I'm speaking about the discipline of sociology, which sometimes is just a label that's too much structural, too much abstraction, and maybe because the way we do research is a bit different in the last, I don't know, 15, 20 years, which is more micro level. These institutions are approaching us. I would like to do this. What do you think about this? This is more a small level, not national. We don't have a national impact, but at a local or regional level, we have, I would say, more impact. At least we can give more advice. 20 years ago, nobody was asking us, actually.
Yeah. Okay. Dalia's looking at me. So you want to say something quickly at the end?
I'm going to be a bit provocative, but I think we have to be creative and not think that policymakers are going to read our peer-reviewed journal articles. And that speaks up to how we transfer knowledge, and that we have to have methods that are way more straightforward, short, and rapid than what we're used to. And it's true that for younger scholars, it's hard, but I think we can pair up like more senior researchers with younger ones and show them also the way to do this. But I think that we have to be more creative and think of new pathways to get the research out there and to get it to policymakers. And it's not necessarily with a conversation with a policymaker that's going to happen, but there's other pathways to reach policymakers and social actors.
Thank you, and a very good point to make. In fact, our Vice Chancellor is going to be pretty talking about just that in a moment. On that note, can you please put your hands together for our panel?